This past February, Williams and the Promise Institute jointly held a convening that brought together experts from research and practice to examine knowledge gaps and data that's needed to help promote the rights of LGBTIQ migrants, and reports from that will be coming out soon. Today, though, we're really eager to build on that conversation with a more specific look at race and SOGI. I'd also like to note that this webinar is the first in a series of webinars that the Williams Institute is hosting this week as part of our annual update. This continues tomorrow with a panel on Indigenous LGBTQ+ people, disparities, and data justice. And similarly, the Promise Institute is hosting a number of events this month related to racial justice and human rights. Their next event on April 12th will include the Promise Institute's own Priya Morley, who will be in conversation with Professors Tendai Achiume and Ashley Bali to discuss how to bring questions of race and empire together in international law, including in the context of borders and migration. So we hope you'll tune in for all of that. According to the UN Refugee Agency, UNHCR, there are 26.6 million refugees and 4.4 million asylum seekers worldwide. But the precise number who identify as lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender, or intersex or queer is really unknown, nor do we have rigorous data on the number of persons who are seeking asylum due to persecution on the basis of sexual orientation or gender identity. Last year, the Williams Institute published a report estimating that 30,900 LGBT people applied for asylum in the US between 2012 and 2017, based on available data. But that number is likely an undercount given how many LGBT asylum seekers may fear disclosing their identity and possibly subjecting themselves to violence and discrimination, and also that many government agencies simply don't collect that kind of demographic data. While research shows that LGBTQI refugees face discrimination and harassment at all steps in navigating the refugee status determination and asylum process, those challenges are often compounded by racial discrimination. Indeed, recent reports by UNHCR and human rights organizations show how some Black and Brown people fleeing the war in Ukraine have been discriminated against and in some cases blocked from seeking refuge in neighboring countries. So to explore these compounding challenges and what more we need to know to try to address them, I am joined today by a truly enviable panel of experts who I'll briefly introduce. First, Edafe Okporo is a global gay rights activist, the founder of Refuge America, an organization with a vision to empower and support LGBTQ displaced people in rebuilding their lives in new communities. He's the author of the forthcoming book, Asylum, a memoir and manifesto, which we'll place a link to in the chat. And he's among the inaugural winners of the David Prize, which honors individuals with bold visions for creating a better and brighter New York City. He's also a Logo 30 honoree. Next, Bridget Crawford is the legal director at Immigration Equality, the leading LGBTQ immigrant rights organization in the US. Bridget supervises Immigration Equality's legal services program, which provides representation to over 800 LGBTQ and HIV positive individuals annually through in-house staff and a nationwide network of pro bono attorneys. In addition, Bridget manages Immigration Equality's impact litigation and policy advocacy and directly represents clients in proceedings. We're also joined by Farah Abdi, the Asylum and Communications Officer for TGEU, Transgender Europe. Farah fled to Europe in 2012, fearing persecution because of her gender identity. And Farah has worked over the last 8 years to tell the unheard stories of refugees, including writing and publishing her autobiography, Never Arrive, in 2015. And she's written columns on immigration for publications like Malta Today and The New Internationalist. Just a quick note that Farah will be off camera due to some internet connectivity issues, but we look forward to her comments through audio. And Mariano Ruiz is project coordinator for Fundación AMAL in Argentina, which works to increase the number of resettled refugees through the promotion, strengthening, and dissemination of the community sponsorship model in different communities across the country. He is a board member and secretary for Latin America and the Caribbean for the International Day Against Homophobia, Transphobia, and Biphobia. Welcome to everyone. Thank you so much for joining us. I have a few questions to kick off the conversation, but to everyone in the audience, please feel free to write any comments you have in the Q&A function, and we'll do our best to get to them, to as many as possible. So Edafe, perhaps to start with you, I wonder if you can begin by telling us about your experience. How did race shape your experience as an LGBTQI asylum seeker negotiating the US immigration system? What do you feel your experience tells us about anti-Blackness in the US immigration system?
Thank you very much, Ari. It will be really difficult to use one experience as the defining experience of race relation for LGBTQ displaced people, but I will allow the audience to permit me to use my experience as a single story to exemplify the kind of struggles LGBTQI people face when they approach the borders of the US. I think that my experience alone is a single story, and there are so many people that my experience represents, but I just haven't allowed them out to give a voice to this experience. So in 2016, I fled my country based on my sexual orientation and not based on my race. So I didn't know that, I don't know if I would say I'm a Black person in Nigeria because we're 99% Black country. We are all Blacks. So when I came to the US, I believe that I was bluntly naive towards what it means to be discriminated upon based on your race. So I got to the border and asked for asylum. Upon asking for asylum, I was taken to a detention center. So I think that the detention center has been used to masquerade protection under the disguise of like vetting people or temporary check for people who come to the US. But every arriving alien who arrives at the US border is being detained by USCIS. So at the detention center, that was the first place I feel like my race got to play a role because I was in a place with other um, Black folks from Africa or the Middle East, majority of countries where where there's discrimination for being gay. So as an LGBTQ person that is being kept in a detention center who is openly gay, I felt discriminated by the immigrant community at the detention center. And it's not just me alone. Um, Although I was masculine presenting, more feminine presenting people are being uh, violated verbally, emotionally. There was a trans person in my dorm because her birth certificate says male because she couldn't change a birth certificate in Morocco before she came to the US. She was being misgendered as a man and kept in a detention center with other men. She could have been raped or something more violent could have happened to her. So I think that the detention center was built as a system to deter Black and brown people from coming to the US because a majority of people in the detention center are Black and brown. So I feel like as an African who came to the US to seek protection, I was being discriminated against by other Africans. But when I was granted asylum and I came into the American community, in the gay community, I was seen as a Black person. And in the Black community, I'm seen as an African. And in that African refugee community, I'm seen as a gay person. And, I'm supposed to assess that African community as a resource, but I was unable to access that resource because of my sexual orientation. So I could not find social gathering where I felt welcome among African social community. Uh, in the white spaces, I was regarded as an African, so I could not fit in. So I fled my country based on my sexual orientation to the US, and I still felt like I'm being exiled because of the intersection of being a gay person and being a Black person. So I think that is systematic, is built into the system of how people are being processed into the US. So I think it's a systematic way of oppressing Black and brown people by masquerading detention as as a temporary place for housing people. When I came to the US, there was no resources for legal services for asylum seekers because we're not yet US citizens. Luckily, there was an organization like Immigration Equality who represented me with pro bono legal services. I think that before I got represented by Immigration Equality, I wrote to other organizations, but because I've been historically marginalized as a gay person, it was difficult for me to write in a letter to an organization that, hey, I'm a gay person who came to the US to seek protection. So I think that there is more to do with the intersectionality of being gay and being Black that makes it difficult for you to access spaces that are supposed to be available for you as a gay person. So I think that the major difference between me as a gay Black asylum seeker from other asylum seekers is that they can be integrated into the immigrants and refugee community, but it's not just easy for me to access those spaces because of the complexity of my sexual orientation, which is frowned upon by people who come from those countries. Just makes it difficult to access both social services and both social spaces that other immigrants can access.
You mentioned being represented by Immigration Equality, and I wonder if we can bring Bridget in now. Bridget, in the context of your work, what is the role of race in how LGBTQI migrants experience US laws and policies, and how do you see that playing out in the clients that you interact with?
Well, piggybacking off of what Edafe said about the systemic racism, I think that you see this basically reflected in all of our laws, in the laws themselves. And I think the very foundations of many, if not most of our immigration laws are rooted in racism. And that continues today. And when you layer on top of that another minority status like LGBTQ identity, that compounds the impact of these racist laws. And as you look back in our history, there are many examples to point to. Some old, for instance, probably the earliest example after the Revolutionary War, even the US continued to exploit enslaved people while simultaneously recruiting more free white settlers from Europe. And then the US codified this racial exclusion in the Naturalization Act of 1790, which restricted citizenship to, in quotes, any alien being a free white person. Then you jump forward to the next century, the mid 1800s, the gold rush opened new migration routes from China. This set off waves of anti-immigrant sentiment. Again, at this time, Chinese migrants were described as an unarmed invasion force that would replace white Americans, taking away jobs while bringing disease and drugs, which sounds a lot like rhetoric that we are still hearing today. And in response, at that time, the US passed the Page Act of 1875, which prohibited the entry of Asian women, and the Chinese Exclusion Act of 1882, which barred all Chinese immigrants. And these themes have continued today, literally, in law after law that has passed. And while some of these early laws were eventually overturned, others have taken their place. You know, you take, for instance, the Muslim bans, which were a series of discriminatory executive orders and proclamations issued by the Trump administration, enacted to bar people from Muslim majority nations. And of course, Title 42, which I'm sure many of you are familiar with, which was a pseudo-scientific and discriminatory policy by the CDC enacted under President Trump that both the Trump and Biden administrations used to carry out mass expulsions of hundreds of thousands of people at the southern border. And according to a report by Human Rights First, at least 9,886 kidnappings, torture, rape, and other violent attacks took place on people blocked or expelled to Mexico due to Title 42. And that was under the Biden administration alone. And of course, we know that thousands and thousands of people were not allowed to pursue their asylum claims under Title 42. And this was by design, and according to reports, was Stephen Miller's intent in creating this policy to stop immigration at the southern border. And I'm happy to say that the Biden administration announced on Friday that it was finally ending Title 42, but the policy was in effect for 2 years, and of course, disproportionately impacted immigrants of color, since the vast majority of people subject to Title 42 were Black and brown immigrants from Mexico, Central and South America, and the Caribbean. And according to the study by Human Rights First, the policy had a disparate racial impact on Black asylum seekers and migrants. For instance, we saw Haitian and other Black asylum seekers who were blocked in or expelled to Mexico face widespread anti-Black violence and discrimination in Mexico. We saw thousands of Haitians return to Haiti without any due process or ability to access the asylum system, even though our law actually guarantees them that access. And we saw those images of CBP agents rounding up terrified Haitian asylum seekers on horseback, only to deport them back to Haiti, again, without access to the immigration system. And, although Title 42 is scheduled to end, the problems will continue under MPP, otherwise known as Remain in Mexico, which is also racist in its implementation and design because, again, it's designed to keep people at the southern border out. Under this program, people will face the same violence they faced under Title 42. And although theoretically they have access to the immigration system, this is largely, an illusion. There is no real access to counsel or due process in this program. The grant rate is exceedingly low. So in effect, this is another ban designed to stop people of color from accessing the immigration system. Separate and apart from these border policies, there's also the criminalization of entry and re-entry, which has a devastating impact upon immigrants of color. Basically, there are criminal sanctions for immigrants coming into the United States that have been used for years to advance anti-immigrant and racist policy goals. The laws used to criminally prosecute people for entering and re-entering the United States are known as sections 1325 and 1326 of the US Code. And these laws were actually passed in the 1920s during the height of the eugenics movement to further racist and white supremacist ideology. And the racist intentions of the laws are still felt today. The Justice Department data shows that prosecution for unauthorized reentry disproportionately impacts Mexican and Latinx individuals. Roughly 94% of people prosecuted for unauthorized reentry in 2021, 2020, and 2021 were from Mexico, Honduras, Guatemala, and El Salvador. In recent years, people charged under these sections have been challenging the law based on the fact that Congress enacted it for overtly racist purposes. And last year, a judge in the District of Nevada found that Section 1326 is indeed unconstitutional for these reasons. The government unfortunately appealed, and the decision is now before the Ninth Circuit. But, I think ending 1325 and 1326 prosecutions is essential to ending systemic injustices in the immigration system. You take that even a step further, in addition to unlawful entry, re-entry, contact with the criminal justice system more generally has a very profound impact on entitlement and access to immigration relief. Since marginalized groups are disproportionately harmed by the criminal justice system, including LGBTQ people and people of color, this in turn then harms their ability to seek immigration relief. So it's really a matter of access. I think as Edafe pointed out, immigration detention also furthers these injustices. People who are picked up on criminal charges are placed in immigration detention, whether it's because of unlawful entry or re-entry, as we just talked about, or simple arrival at the border, or because of crimes committed while in the United States. But once someone is in that immigration detention center, it makes it much harder to access counsel, to win your case. Then there is the rampant racial and anti-LGBTQ discrimination and mistreatment that happens inside of those detention facilities. And I think just sort of a way to see how this plays out in real time too is media coverage of different refugee crises and attention paid by the US and Europe especially. I think you can see this somewhat in the reaction to refugees in the Ukraine. And I know that Ari mentioned refugees of color in the Ukraine. However, if you sort of compare the situation in Ukraine with some crises in the rest of the world, you see differences. In no way do I want to downplay the suffering of Ukrainians. Of course, it is truly horrific. And I was really happy to see that there is some welcome in Europe and in the United States to refugees fleeing the crisis there. However, we don't see that same type of welcome offered to refugees fleeing other major crises. When you juxtapose this against the treatment of immigrants of color who are fleeing horrific persecution and are met with Title 42, MPP, Muslim bans, Syrians and Afghans being turned away, the crises in the Democratic Republic of Congo, Myanmar, you can go on, and you see a very different reaction by the US government and by European governments in particular. And I think specifically looking at this through the LGBTQ lens, I think what holds true for nearly every refugee crisis in the world is that for virtually all of these countries are deadly for LGBTQ people. And sadly, the world refugee mechanisms are especially ineffective when protecting this population.
I think that's actually a great segue and way to sort of telescope out to what's happening in Europe. And maybe with that, we can turn to Farah. Farah, how does this compare in the European context to what Edafe and Bridget have been talking about, specifically with respect to the work of TGEU and transgender refugees? How do you see race compounding the barriers to asylum that racialized transgender migrants face there?
Thank you very much, Ari, and thank you, Edafe and Bridget, for the conversation. And actually, it's a perfect segue because Bridget was talking about how the Ukrainian situation and the influx of refugees from Ukraine is being responded to or reacted to by European governments. You cannot see me because of my internet. The internet in Germany is pretty horrific. So I wanted you to hear me more than see me. The European governments in less than a month of the Ukraine crisis, and by no way am I, as Bridget said, implying that the situation in Ukraine is not a crisis or that Ukrainian refugees do not deserve all the help that they are getting or they deserve to get. But within less than a month of the Ukraine crisis, in the first week of March, European governments came together at the Commission and unanimously agreed to implement something called the Temporary Protection Directive, which is a directive that was implemented in 2001, but has never been triggered by European government. It's the first time that it's being triggered. And that basically means Ukrainian refugees or refugees coming from Ukraine do not face any of the barriers other refugees faced before. They don't have to do demeaning asylum interviews. They get an automatic residence permit in any country they go to. They can choose to go or settle in any of the member states. They don't have to be humiliated and subjected to degrading laws like the Dublin regulation, which other refugees have dealt with for many, many years. And that clearly sends a message that white lives matter and brown and black lives do not. And actually, some politicians shamelessly have gone on the record and gone on TV and actually said that they are more tolerant and they are more welcoming to Ukrainian refugees because Ukrainian refugees look like them, because Ukrainian refugees are blonde, because Ukrainian refugees are a majority of Christians and others are not. And that is absolutely disgusting because it directly sends a message that other refugee lives do not matter. And LGBTQI plus refugees, especially trans refugees, especially trans women of color who flee their countries and oftentimes embark on very precarious and difficult journeys, arrive here with a lot of trauma, and they are subjected to humiliating interviews. They are subjected to detention centers. They are subjected to the Dublin regulation, as I said. They're subjected to not getting the healthcare that they need and deserve. They're subjected to being imprisoned in the wrong detention centers. They're being subjected to very long and strenuous legal gender recognition procedures. And the Temporary Protection Directive does away with all of that for Ukrainian refugees. And that, as I said, sends a very clear message on whose lives are important for European governments. And the intersectionality of it all is very clear, especially with what brown and people of color are facing at the borders in Ukraine and in coming into Poland. And then trans refugees and trans women of color specifically find themselves in very interesting intersections, especially in Europe today, where there's an increasing anti-gender movement, which is very well financed, which is backed by big European governments like the Hungarian government and the Polish government, and is coming out very clearly and very openly and saying that trans women are not women, and portraying trans women as infringing on lesbian rights, as infringing on women's rights. And that intersection is very, very deadly. It's a very deadly cocktail that has been brewing in Europe for a very long time, and is reflecting actually on the statistics that TGEU, for example, presents. Last year, with our Trans Murder Monitoring Report, 96% of the 375 trans and gender diverse people who are reported to have been murdered between October 2020 and September 2021 were trans women, and specifically trans women of color. 89% of those killed in the United States were people of color, trans women of color. 43% of those killed in Europe were trans migrants, mostly women. And it's very clear, it's in the data, that trans people living in the intersections of race and gender and migration status are deeply suffering, whether it's on the Northern American context or it's in the European context. But what these governments forget, I speak often as a policy officer and I come from a policy background now, but what these governments forget is that trans women of color, especially trans refugees like myself, come from a long lineage of powerful women, my mother, my grandmother, and no white politician or European policymaker is going to put our community down. They might deny us our rights, they might jail us, they might subject us to humiliating procedures, but at the end of the day, we are going to come out triumphant because we have something that they don't have. We have community, we have tenacity, we have, we stand on the shoulders of our ancestors like Marsha P. Johnson and Sylvia Rivera. And that is what most of these policymakers and these governments forget, is that we are in it for the long haul, and we are a community. Like last week, during the Trans Day of Remembrance, the UK government came out with leaked papers from Downing Street that the UK government was planning to do away or scrap the conversion therapy, the ban on conversion therapy that they had promised for so long. And then once they saw a backlash, they did a specific U-turn immediately and said, no, we are not going to do away with introducing legislation for conversion therapy, but we will only do it for sexuality, not gender identity. And today, more than 100 organizations in the UK came out and said that we are boycotting, which is very sinister. The UK government is planning to hold a big conference in June called something like it's okay, free to be me. And how can you be free to be me while the UK is actively funding, the UK government is actively funding radical feminist movements that are openly anti-trans rights and specifically anti-trans women rights. free to be me with what, you know? So our community is actively coming together and saying we are standing shoulders to shoulder. And if you deny one community or one aspect of our community their rights, you cannot dangle carrots on our face and divide us, because the model of divide and conquer that the colonialists, the British Empire, the European governments used for so long is absolutely gone. So thank you very much.
Farah, thank you so much. I'd like to bring in Mariano now. Mariano, you know, a lot of observers, I think, look to Argentina as a model of progressive legal frameworks for LGBTIQ asylum seekers. And I wonder if you can talk about that context, the work that Fundación AMAL does, and whether or not the laws actually translate to a supportive context for asylum seekers in practice. And if not, you know, sort of where things fall short, especially with respect to racial minorities there.
Thank you, Ari, for the invite and for being in this prestigious panel with everyone here. As you may know, Argentina, since 2010, has been a model for protection of LGBTIQ human rights, with the approval of equal marriage law back in 2010 and gender identity law back in 2012. So in terms of resettlement, Argentina had since 2015, a resettlement program known as the Syria program, which was improved by the following administrations, and it finally implemented community sponsorship as a model of resettlement, copying the Canadian model. So within this model of community sponsorship, many gay Syrians arrived to the country since 2015 up to now. It's interesting to say as well that because of the COVID pandemic and copying many European countries and countries from the global north, Argentina imposed a close in the borders for more than 365 days. So it was more than a year with borders closed. And this made that many people that were willing to cross the border due to family reunification processes or just seeking asylum, especially for other countries in Latin America, in this case, I mean, the most prominent one is Venezuela, were not allowed to seek asylum at the borders because of, with excuse of the pandemic. So also back since 2017, we started getting other asylum seekers from other regions, such as Jamaica and Chechnya, with the Chechen crisis due to the persecution of gay and bisexual men, and many other Russians that identified as LGBTIQ. So for my work previously in another grassroots-based LGBT organization and my current work in Fundación AMAL, I can say that the advocacy that we did from civil society had turned into positive, let's say, positive advocacy that ended in that people that identify as LGBTIQ and seek asylum in the country, their cases were resolved in between 6 to 8 months. Meanwhile, cases for other people with other means of seeking asylum might take up to 2 years. So at some point, the different administrations that we had in this last couple of years understood that being LGBT and seeking asylum was a sustained reason to grant this protection. But at the same time, the lack of resources of our country due to our social and economic background and situation that is always like a roller coaster makes that the resources available for people that are coming with no means of survival, no money at all, makes it really complicated for them to establish in the country. We can make a division in between the people that came through resettlement, which are being identified by UNHCR and are being matched with a community organization through community sponsorship. They go to one category, and people that are just traveling by their own means or with the help of other NGOs and get to the country and seek asylum at the border have other treatment. So it's totally different. I mean, the situation of people that are coming through the border with no funding at all, they fall to the UNHCR humanitarian emergency funding, which is a fund that is distributed to everyone who's coming with no money at all. But we can say that that funding is actually, and for the last 30 years in Argentina, being distributed by different faith-based organizations that are currently not friendly with the LGBTIQ community. So the treatment that these people get is, I mean, they definitely don't understand intersectionality between being an asylum seeker, being a person of color, and living in a country which is mostly white passing. And they need a protection because they might live with HIV, or they might have a different gender expression than what people expect them to have. So they would not understand the need of having separate language classes for Jamaicans, for example, because they were not willing to be put together with other fellow Jamaicans, just because the patterns of discrimination within their nationalities, although they are in a country that respects the rights of LGBTIQ people, just are the same that at home. So when trying to take Spanish classes, Jamaicans were put with other African people, and they would be treated differently just because they didn't feel safe in that context, just because these organizations were not understanding that being LGBT and being a person of color and having a different gender expression than what others will expect from gay men specifically will be an issue and will not make them feel safe in those Spanish classes. So part of our job is raising all of these topics to the UNHCR regional office, which had been trying to do some efforts, but we cannot forget that these organizations that manage the funding are faith-based and non-progressive. So another point that I can detect in between that I heard it from the clients that we serve is that many times, although Argentina has a system in which everyone, no matter their residency status, can access to the healthcare system, if you are a person of color and you don't speak the language and you have a gender expression different of what everyone expects from you, it would not be that easy to get to access healthcare. So that is another point in which the law falls short. We can say that it's not common and it's not frequent to see people of color in Argentina, especially speaking about Jamaicans or Africans. So this makes them a minority within the majority in the country. And the situations of discrimination will happen. And the government is not doing actually not much to avoid those situations. It's also important to raise that there's a lack of data on LGBTIQ refugees and migrants. We actually don't know we just only serve the ones that are reaching to our organization or the ones that are being contacted before coming with our organization through other organizations such as Rainbow Railroads or people that are being referenced by others that live here for us to provide them assistance. But other than that, we don't have data, and the government is not collecting specific data to be able to implement effective public policies to address all these issues that we raise as civil society. So definitely, although we are far away, Argentina is definitely a safe place for LGBTIQ refugees and migrants, but also we need to take into consideration that as a white passing country, and I say white passing because we are all Latinos. And although if you make a survey here, you will see that most people identify as Hispanic just because our inheritance of Italian and Spaniard immigration after Second World War II. So the country has been built in an idea that everyone is a descendant from Europe, and Argentines feel more than Europeans than Latinos. So that makes patterns of discrimination similar to the ones that are being seen in Europe, in Spain, in Italy, in which people are now more open to receive Ukrainians than Africans. We are seeing the same right now with Ukraine. The government just opened a humanitarian visa slot for Ukrainians living in Ukraine because of the war. And the quantity of messages that we are receiving from citizens that are willing to assist are a higher number than the ones that we receive with Syrians. So definitely, because people consider that Ukrainians look more similar than them. They are Catholic, they are white, they have blue eyes. So I feel that there's a connection of what's happening here with this from what Farah was saying that is happening in Germany and in Europe as well.
Thank you, Mariano. And we're getting a few different questions, so I'll try to field them and hopefully get through as many as possible. Edafe, we have one question that I was hoping to pose to you about what are the consequences of internalized oppression that you or others that you've spoken to face during the immigration process?
Thank you very much, Ari, and thank you very much for the person that asked that question. I just want to say, first of all, LGBTQI people have faced historic marginalization. Be you an immigrant or not, they are being the self-doubt of if I am accepted or if I am welcome. And there are some signs we look for when we go to access services or when we want to tell our story. Is this place safe? If I am vulnerable in this situation, would I be accepted? Me, as a gay person, I was out in my country before I came to the US. So it was easy for me to talk about my sexual orientation because I've talked about it in community. But people who live in secrecy all their life, some people have been forced to get married in their home country. There are laws which will persecute them by being stoned to death. Talking about their sexual orientation is not something that they've become familiar with. And that becomes difficult in the court of law to prove your sexual orientation as a reason for persecution according to the asylum law. On the other hand, after some people have been granted asylum, I've seen people gone back to the closet because of the conditions they found themselves in. They are like, I don't want to mix up with the Jamaican community or with the African community because they would still, these are the places I'm supposed to find safety from. So there are three issues in which organizations were found out that organizations do not have the competency when trying to welcome LGBTQI people that have suffered marginalization. One is they do not have the competency on the historic marginalization that gay people have suffered that have led them to go into the closet. Two is that some legal organizations who want to represent LGBTQI asylum seekers do not display visibility or signs that make these asylum seekers feel like they are welcome, like a flag, a pin, or a symbol in their office or on their website that shows you that you are welcome or you can access services there. Lastly, LGBTQI people who have been oppressed in their countries, when they come to the US, detention is another form of trauma. So when they are re-traumatized by detention, isolation, sometimes emotional harassment or even physical harassment, when they get out of detention, post-detention, there is no affirming care for them. So it leads them to be reclusive. So if I'm a trans person and I go to a place and I don't feel like I've been cared for because when I asked for care in the detention center, I was being ignored. How can I open myself up to trust a social service worker to be able to accept affirming care? HIV positive people being afraid to access services because they feel like they are being marginalized because when they came into the US through detention, they were being marginalized. So one thing that really makes it difficult and like kind of further increase the internalization for Black people, especially in America, is that the level of acceptance of Black community for the LGBTQI community is lower compared to white community. So if I am a gay person, that I felt like coming to the US would be an opportunity for me to be free to be myself. And I come into a Black community that still practice religious practices that makes it difficult for them to even accept their own. How would I be free to be myself in that community? So I kind of internalize that phobia. And if I try to assess the white spaces because of racism within the LGBTQ community, it makes people kind of internalize more fear that leads to going back into the closet instead of coming here as an asylum seeker and being part of a community. So there are so many reasons, but I think that race and historical marginalization makes it difficult for people who come here to be like, hey, I'm at the last line of the mile. I'm just going to be free to be myself.
We have a question here about social integration. Only 20 to 30 countries legally recognize SOGI for persecution on recognizing refugee status. So the question is, are there specific policies of care when receiving LGBT refugees and migrants? Do we have information about integration and also relocation when it comes specifically to LGBT folks? And referencing a pilot project in Brazil. I wonder, Mariano, perhaps you can take that and given all the work that you do with Fundación AMAL.
Yeah, thank you very much, Abdi, for that question. It's really important because currently, together with Rainbow Railroads, a Canadian-based NGO that helps people fleeing danger because on the means of being LGBTIQ, and together with an organization that is binational, that's called Al Otro Lado, in between Mexico and the United States, we're conducting a survey in the southern border, in which we are trying to detect which people are waiting there because of the Title 42 and the Remain in Mexico policy, which cases we consider that might not be that strong or might be rejected or have a previous deportation from the States that will make them difficult to seek asylum in the US. And we are trying to find other routes for them to be able to resettle. One of these routes will be to Argentina, in which in the next semester, we'll try to relocate 5 cases as a pilot, creating community sponsorship groups here in different cities in our country, because we consider that community sponsorship is the best way in which people can integrate in the community. So in this case, what we'll do is create these 5 groups, bring 5 people that we mostly will specifically target people from Central America that are located in the border, and we'll fly them to Argentina, put them together with these groups, and for a year provide housing, food, communications, and the support of this group for them to have a successful relocation. So as this person was mentioning of the pilot project in Brazil, this will be a pilot that will be conducted in between Canada, Mexico, and Argentina to try to find an option for those that might not find an option in the US and might be stuck in Mexico right now.
There's another question building on some of the comments that Farah made specifically about threats to trans migrants. In the context of widespread attacks and human rights violations against trans people in the US right now in particular, there's a question about current legal and policy frameworks in the US that are failing racialized trans migrants and what, if any, steps are being taken to address this urgent issue. Bridget, I wonder if I can put you on the spot, if you have thoughts about that, or in the work that you're doing with immigration equality and racialized trans migrants, and in particular among your clients, and the policy work that you're doing, if you're seeing kind of specific steps being taken to address those threats.
That's a really good question. I don't think that there's a good solution or answer to it, to be honest with you. I think, as we see all of these anti-trans laws crop up in a lot of states, It's really a slap in the face to people who have fled to the United States to escape persecution in their country of origin on the basis of their gender identity, and then they come here, and then we're seeing this type of legislation in the US. I think just sort of practically, there are, fixes that I think people cobble together in order to try and ensure that people, once they're released from detention, are relocating in places where we don't see these laws. I think that is not the best solution, because of course there are still people that are in detention facilities in areas where there's so much anti-trans sentiment. I think on the policy front, one of the big pushes from a lot of organizations, ours included, is to stop the detention of trans people altogether, because despite decades of attempts, even by well-meaning administrations, to protect trans people in immigration detention, they always fail. And so it is not a place, in my opinion, I don't think there should be immigration detention at all, but most certainly for trans folks, it is a place where we see constant mistreatment, sexual assaults, constant misgendering, overuse of solitary confinement as a quote unquote protective mechanism. So I think it's a great problem to identify. I think that there are attempts to try to mitigate that damage, but not a solution. I think when you're talking about refugee resettlement, as opposed to asylum seekers who come to the United States and are part of that process, there are attempts and good outcomes with refugee resettlement organizations that really take into account places where LGBTQ refugees will be safe and will be in communities where they can live safely, and taking into account the autonomy of the people they're serving to see where they want to be placed. Because, I think, as Edafe pointed out, there are some people that want to maybe be within a community that is their community of, country of origin, but a large percentage of people do not want that for all of the reasons that Edafe pointed out. So I think in the refugee context, that is something that's very much thought through. At the same time, I think one of the bigger problems in the refugee context is that process largely ignores LGBTQ people and excludes them because they're not identified in the refugee referral system to begin with. So unfortunately, I don't have solutions. I sort of have more problems. But yeah, I think something else that I've noted lately too is the use by adjudicators, judges, in talking about asylum claims, pointing out that the US is unable to, or is sometimes unable to protect trans people, and comparing that to a country of origin and kind of using that against asylum seekers, which is also a disturbing trend, basically saying, well, Mexico has passed laws to try to help trans people, and unfortunately, they're not entirely successful, but the same can be said in the United States. So therefore, this person isn't eligible for asylum. So we have seen that too, which is kind of an ugly flip side of all of this.
Yeah, and that actually, I think, dovetails with another question. I know we're getting to the end of the conversation, unfortunately, but if panels, perhaps I'll pose two questions and folks can pick whatever they'd like to just wrap up some final thoughts with. But one is specifically about the role of racial biases and stereotypes in adjudicating asylum claims, and whether in your work or your own experience you've seen that, and to what extent biases and preconceptions around gender identity and sexual orientation are negatively impacting claims. And then secondly, Mariano and others, I think implicitly have talked about data gaps and what we don't know, and what kinds of information would be useful to better promote the rights of LGBTIQ refugees and asylum seekers. So I wonder if anyone has thoughts about specific data that could help fill these gaps and better promote policies in this space. Edafe?
So I'm just going to speak a little bit about the trans asylum seekers that Human Rights Watch published 3 months ago on, Bridget spoke about the MPP, the migrant protocol that brought about the remain in Mexico. Human Rights Watch found that over 1,200 trans and LGBTQ asylum seekers who self-identify were victims of rape and torture at the US-Mexico border. This is information that is available to the Biden administration, yet they haven't changed the policy. So it's intentional that migration issues in America is very polarizing and all over the world. And LGBTQ immigrants is a new way of seeking asylum compared to traditional refugee resettlement with the 1950 Refugee Convention document. And I think that is a responsibility for us as people in academia, activists, and people who provide social services to come to the table to look at what are the issues that other communities are faced that the LGBTQ community is likely to face. Because when Jewish immigrants were coming after the war, they faced similar sentiments of discrimination based on race, based on other factors. And I think that the LGBTQ community is facing these issues because acceptance is not really as broad as we would have wanted it to be at this point. There's still fight in America to accept trans people. There's still fight in America to say gay in Florida. So I think that because acceptance in our communities is still low, the idea of LGBTQI people coming into this country to seek protection is still being frowned upon. But institutionally, the US immigration policies have been built to punish Black and brown people from coming into this country. So it's not like it's just focused on LGBTQI people. It's focused on all Black people, all brown people, people who do not look like they deserve to seek protection in this country. So I think the question we're trying to answer is that what would make the US immigration policies be more better? I think we have to address that question of race in American immigration policies for us to be able to address every other question, be it LGBTQI, be it biphobia or whatsoever. We have to address that issue of like race and how it applies to the US immigration policies.
Mm-hmm. Farah, I will give you the last word. We're just at time, so I see your hand.
Yeah, I'm going to respond to the question about biases and how it affects asylum application outcomes.
Yes.
I think one of the things that we have come into contact with a lot in our work and also in my own activism and personal experience is definitely there's a bias there, especially when it comes to LGBTQI plus refugees, but especially trans refugees, because trans refugees and LGBTQI plus refugees in general have constantly complained about immigration officers, have constantly complained about asylum determination officers, and particularly interpreters, whereby trans refugees have been subjected to becoming the educators in the interview themselves, whereby they have to explain something as basic as pronouns or who a trans person is to their asylum officers. And at that time, that can be very traumatic because you're sitting in front of somebody who you have never met in your life, and you are about to explain things that you have not even talked to your family about, secrets that you have been carrying all your life. And then through that trauma and while trying to compose yourself, you have to educate this person on your own identity. And sometimes trans people do not have the necessary language to do that at that time. So because of all that tension and all that trauma in that interview, there's definitely most of the time going to be a negative outcome. And then trans people have to fall again into the system of fighting a negative or a rejected asylum claim and trying to explain later on, okay, like this is what happened and this is why I was nervous and this is why I couldn't speak up. So there's definitely a bias there, and it definitely affects trans refugees.
Thank you, Farah. It's clearly a lot of dimensions to this really important set of issues, and we could take another hour just to begin to scratch the surface. But I want to thank all of our panelists for joining us today and for their expertise and sharing their experiences, as well as everyone in the audience for joining and submitting questions. Thank you again, and we'll look forward to continuing this conversation in the weeks and months to come.